best, Ted. You're going to fry, and I'm going to be here. And I'll be the best, just like they said. The number one. Mr. Stone had it all right.
1986. Gerard John Schaefer, a former cop and one of America's most prolific serial killers, talked about how he bragged to Ted Bundy about the way he killed his victims. Little did he know that a far gruesome fate awaited him. These are dirty cops who were instantly killed in jail. April 5th, 2018, Michael Adekwu, a former elite Nigerian officer, led a group of men to carry out one of the most deadly robbery attacks in the nation's history. The events that followed are indeed intriguing, and it would all end with Michael paying the ultimate price once he stepped into jail. 2012. Michael Adekwu was dismissed from the police force. He was once a respected member of the Nigerian police force, serving in the Kwara State Command Special Anti-Robbery Squad, aka SARS. But soon his career took a dark turn when he was caught selling firearms to criminals. SARS officers are feared in Nigeria and have become notorious for terrorizing the citizens instead of providing security. These officers are as dirty and corrupt as they come. Michael was subsequently arrested, tried, and sentenced to 3 years in prison for criminal conspiracy and aiding the escape of armed robbery suspects. In 2015, Michael got out of prison, but he didn't return to a lawful life. Instead, he became deeply involved in criminal activities, forming a notorious gang that carried out several armed robberies across Kwara State and beyond. His knowledge of police operation and tactics made him a formidable criminal, and he quickly rose to prominence in the underworld. Michael had become so powerful that even the biggest political leaders in the country wanted him to work for them, for it was common practice for these politicians to have criminals carry out their dangerous assignments. This made Michael not only a criminal, but one with political backing that could get him out of trouble with the police. So on April 5th, 2018, Michael led a gang of armed robbers in a meticulously planned attack on 5 banks in OFA, Kwara State. The robbery was executed with military precision, involving the use of explosives and heavy gunfire. The gang unleashed terror on the town, killing 33 people, including 9 police officers. The brutality of this shocked the nation and highlighted the severe security challenges Nigeria was facing. These robbers targeted the banks during peak business hours, ensuring maximum impact and chaos. To force their way in, they would use explosives to get through the security doors. Then they used dynamite to breach the bank vaults and ATMs, making off with a significant amount of cash. Now, before striking the banks, the gang had earlier attacked the local police station, killing officers and civilians alike to ensure that there would be no immediate police intervention that would disrupt these bank robberies. The sheer scale and violence of this robbery made it one of the deadliest in Nigeria's history. So the Nigerian police force had launched an extensive manhunt for the perpetrators of the OFA robbery. Through a combination of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and public cooperation, the police were able to identify and apprehend several suspects, including Michael Adekwu. The arrests were made possible by CCTV from the banks and testimonies from witnesses. CCTV had captured the face of Michael Adekwu. Even though it was blurry, some people were able to tell it was the ex-police officer. Now, Michael was arrested along with 5 other suspects named Ayode Akinabuson, Aziz Salahuddin, Niyi Ogandaran, Ibikunle Ogunleye, and Adeola Abraham. These suspects were charged with multiple counts of armed robbery, conspiracy, and culpable homicide. This trial, lasting 6 years, had attracted widespread public interest and a lot of media coverage. But the story was about to take a sinister turn. While in police custody, Michael Adekwu died under mysterious circumstances. The official police statement claimed that Adequo slumped and died during an interrogation. However, that was met with skepticism and outrage from the public and various stakeholders, including the Senate president at the time, Bukola Saraki, who demanded a thorough investigation into Adequo's death. Something was seriously wrong somewhere. You see, the gang of bank robbers had earlier confessed during a press briefing that they worked for the governor of Kwara State and the Senate president. The vehicle used for the bank robbery, a Lexus RX 300, had a custom plate number with the Senate president's name on it. It was claimed that this car was a gift from Saraki to this gang, and the speculation was he was killed to cover this up. But this wasn't the only theory as to why Adequo was immediately snuffed out. There's also allegations that Michael was killed to prevent him from exposing other police officers who might have been complicit in that robbery or maybe other criminal activities. One of the accused, Ibikunle Ogunleye, testified in court that Adequo was deliberately killed by a police officer, known as Mr. Torture, to coerce confessions from the other suspects. The testimony fueled suspicions of a cover-up within the police force. But despite these allegations, the police maintained that Adequo's death was natural and that a post-mortem examination had been conducted. However, the details of that post-mortem were never made public, further deepening the mystery surrounding his death. The trial of the remaining suspects continued without Adequo. September 26, 2024, the Kwara State High Court, presided over by Judge Halima Salman, delivered its verdict. The court found Akinbosun, Salahuddin, Ogundiran, Ogunleye, and Abraham guilty of armed robbery, conspiracy, and culpable homicide. They were sentenced to death by hanging, bringing some closure to the families of the victims and the community of OFA. But as dirty as Michael Adequo was, you can't compare it to what the next cop did.
Hit him and then I killed him. When I hit him and knocked him out, and then I took the shoelaces out of his shoes, tied them together, wrapped it around his neck, and strangled him.
It's October 2014, and retired police officer Theodore Dyer, who was locked up in the Saginaw Correctional Facility for molesting a girl, would meet a judgment more damning than he had hoped for. They say prison's the last place dirty cops want to be, and Dyer paid the ultimate price for his crimes and attitude. Let's go to April 2012. A woman whose identity is being protected but codenamed Susan moved into the quiet town of Grand Haven, Michigan. Now, her next-door neighbor happened to be Theodore Dyer, a retired police officer in his 60s. Dyer had no kids and was living with his girlfriend, so Susan recalls being happy to have such a nice neighbor as Dyer because of how friendly and receptive he was. His years of service in law enforcement had earned him respect, and his personality was that of a kind and approachable man. Dyer and his wife or girlfriend were particularly friendly to Susan's daughter, so much that Susan said they treated her like their own daughter. The girl often stayed over at the Dyer's home when her mother was at work. This would show how much Susan trusted Dyer, but unfortunately, what she didn't know was that Dyer was a predator, and she was about to discover an ugly truth in the most shocking way. June 2013, Susan gets home from work, drops her bag, and goes to Dyer's home to pick up her daughter. That evening, she felt unusually eerie and suspected that something was off. So she decided to make her entry into the house as discreet as possible. Instead of knocking, she walked in and found Dyer in a compromising position with her daughter. Shocked and horrified, she immediately took her daughter home and called the police. So Dyer was arrested and charged with first-degree criminal sexual conduct. During investigation, it was revealed that this wasn't the first time Dyer had assaulted the girl. She told detectives that it happened many times before. The court proceedings were swift, given the overwhelming evidence against Dyer. He was convicted and given 25 to 50 years in prison, but this is where things got serious. Dyer, as an ex-cop, knew that this sentence was as good as a death sentence. He was trapped, surrounded by men who viewed him with a mix of disgust and contempt. Unfortunately, Dyer didn't know how to keep his mouth shut. He once bragged to another inmate about his crime, and what he didn't know was that this would be his last mistake.
Was accused of raping an 11-year-old girl, and you got 25 to life for it, and I told him that's enough. I don't want to hear anymore.
It's October 29th, 2014, just 20 days after he was sentenced. The tension finally snapped. Dyer was found dead in his cell, strangled, with his own shoelaces wrapped around his neck, cutting off his last breaths. His cellmate, Steven Sanderson, a hardened killer already serving a life sentence for a 91 murder, was quick to confess, and there'd be no regret nor remorse in his confession. It was filled with cold satisfaction. Sanderson claimed that Dyer had been bragging about his crimes, talking casually about the horrors he inflicted. So something snapped inside Sanderson. He didn't just want to kill Dyer, he felt he needed to. He punched Dyer right in the chin, and that punch was enough to knock him out cold straight to the floor. Then he carefully removed his shoelaces and used it as garrote to choke Dyer until he stopped breathing. Then Sanderson carefully carried the limp body of Dyer back to the bed and arranged him to look like he was sleeping with a blanket over his body. Then he waited until the next morning before telling the guards to what he did last night. You see, for Sanderson, this wasn't premeditated. He'd initially thought of asking to be transferred to another cell because he was just fed up with Dyer. But then it occurred to him that he could just end it all right there and then. When asked why he did it, Sanderson's answer was chilling. "I did the world a favor," he said, showing no hint of remorse, no flicker of doubt. In his mind, there was no question that Dyer's death was justice, raw, brutal, and final. He didn't just kill a man, he exterminated what he saw as filth. To him, Dyer's last breath was a gift to humanity. His cold, remorseless eyes left no doubt. In the twisted logic of prison, he was a hero now. Dyer, who once enforced the law, had in the end become its ultimate victim. And his downfall is a terrifying reminder of what happens when the line between law and lawlessness blurs.
People think I'm some kind of hero, but I'm actually not. I just, did what I thought was best in the time that I was given.
Despite the gravity of the crime, Sanderson was handed another life sentence. But this time, something surprising was added. He was given the possibility of parole. It was as if the system, so accustomed to punishing the guilty, paused for a moment to consider the fact that maybe Sanderson had killed a man who, to most in prison society, was already damned. A child offender and a former cop, the two most unforgivable crimes in the brutal world behind bars. Perhaps this slim chance of freedom was a reflection of the unspoken sentiment that Sanderson had simply carried out prison justice, delivering the vengeance that many believed Dyer deserved. Dyer was despicable, but as we move down this list, these filthy cops only get dirtier.
Well, I was originally accused of killing 34 women, but nobody has ever managed to come up with 34 names.
We're going to take you to April 7th, 1973, where Gerard John Schaefer, also known as the Killer Cop and Hangman, was arrested on suspicion that he was a serial killer responsible for the death of several ladies across Florida. Now, the inmates weren't going to let him just get away easily with all the atrocities he committed. They made him pay dearly. Schaefer's early life was pretty unremarkable. He was just a Florida kid who wanted to become a cop and uphold the law. At least that's what people perceived, but beneath that crap lay something far more sinister. It was in Florida, after his family relocated, that the first signs of his sick mind began to become visible. As a matter of fact, by the time he became a teenager, he wasn't thinking like your average teenager. Instead, he was captivated by violence and control, nurturing sadistic fantasies that continued to grow darker. Stalking women became his twisted pastime, as Schaefer's mind was filled with visions of female subjugation and torture. Rather than being repelled by the thoughts or seeking some type of redemption, he honed in on his desires, hiding those dark intentions behind a surprising disguise as a law enforcement officer. So it's 1971. At 25 years old, Schaefer becomes that police officer in Wilton Manors, a quiet, unrespecting community near Fort Lauderdale, Florida. That badge on his chest didn't just give him the power he craved. He also gained hunting ground. The position gave him the authority to manipulate, control, and act without raising suspicion. You see, Schaefer's chilling knowledge of police procedure, paired with his cold, calculated nature, made him a meticulous predator. He prowled the streets, not for criminals, but for victims, vulnerable women who never saw it coming. It's July 1972. Schaefer's career as a deputy takes a dark and violent turn. While on duty in Martin County, he comes across two hitchhikers, Pamela Wells and Nancy Trotter. He offers them a friendly ride, and then it becomes something else. With a cold, calculated cruelty, Schaefer drove them to a remote forest. He tied the girls up to tree trunks and enjoyed the agony. He made it clear that their lives were no longer their own, with the aim of making them fear his psychopathic pleasure. However, just as his cruel plan was about to reach its worst moment, a sudden police dispatch call interrupted him. He had to leave, but he told those girls he was coming back. Now, Schaefer had miscalculated something. The girls, driven by sheer terror and the will to survive obviously, had managed to free themselves and get out. They went straight to the police, recounting everything in horrifying detail of their near-death experience. So it didn't take long for authorities to connect the dots, and Schaefer was swiftly arrested. Charged initially with false imprisonment and assault, the real depth of his depravity was yet to unfold. His slip-up in letting the girls escape would become the unraveling thread that exposed a far darker reality. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered a trove of sinister evidence in Schaefer's home. What they found shocked even the most seasoned detectives. We had personal belongings of missing women and some chilling trophies. April 1973, the bones of two girls, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, who had disappeared the previous year and were last seen with Schaefer, were found in Oak Hammock Park, mutilated, broken, and left to decay in a forgotten corner of the woods. That gruesome discovery turned the authorities' focus squarely onto Schaefer, who was now linked to an ever-growing list of missing women. The search of his mother's home, where Schaefer actually lived, would reveal even more horrors. Oh, what they found in the attic was a nightmare. We had diaries full of detailed accounts of rape and murder, personal items belonging to missing women, and sickening trophies taken from the victims. The evidence connected Schaefer to at least 8 more unsolved cases, and yet many suspected that the true number of his victims stretched far beyond what could be proven. So in October 1973, Schaefer was convicted of the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, earning 2 life sentences. But even in the face of overwhelming evidence, his own writings, his twisted keepsakes, and the stark reality of his crimes, this guy clung to his claims of innocence, portraying himself as the victim of a corrupt system. But the evidence painted a far darker picture. A man who had used his badge not to protect, but to exploit, terrorize, and kill. The true horror lay not only in the lives he had stolen, but in the chilling thought of how long his reign of terror had gone unnoticed, and how many more might have fallen victim had fate not intervened in that pivotal moment in 1972. Now, what makes Schaefer's case even more disturbing is the extent of his violent imagination. You see, while in prison, he continued to write. He penned gruesome stories and letters, often describing the murders in explicit detail, though he said these were mere works of fiction. Now, these writings were chillingly similar to the actual details of the crimes he was accused of, which led many to believe that Schaefer was boasting about his real-life atrocities under the guise of storytelling. The full extent of Schaefer's predations may never be known. While he was officially linked to the murders of 2 women, authorities believe he might be responsible for 30 women or perhaps more. His habit of targeting young, vulnerable women and his methodical approach to abducting, torturing, and murdering them made him a uniquely terrifying figure in the history of American crime, but this wasn't the end of his story. As fate would have it, he would soon find himself at the mercy of another inmate. Now, while in prison, Schaefer formed an alliance with the prison guards. He would snitch on other prisoners to gain favor. This went on for a while, with the guards trying their best to keep him safe. On many occasions, the prisoners would throw feces at Schaefer and even try to set his cell on fire on 2 separate instances. It's also believed Schaefer had stepped on the toes of a powerful inmate, and this was all going to end only in one way. The other inmates, fueled by these rumors and a sense of justice, had targeted him. And on December 3, 1995, the inevitable happened. In a brutal attack, an inmate named Rivera unleashed his fury on Schaefer, leaving him with over 40 stab wounds. This guy had broken ribs, his throat was slashed open, and one of his eyes were bashed in. Death hadn't come easy, and he had suffered like many of his victims before he was put out of his misery. Oh, everybody was so happy when he died. Even the judge who sent him to prison acknowledged that this was the punishment Schaefer truly deserved. And if you think that's kind of disturbing, wait until you hear what happened to the next person on the list. It's September 26, 2012. Floresvaldo de Oliveira, better known as Cabo, was shot 20 times after he was sentenced to prison and almost got paroled. And this was revenge for all the dirty jobs he did while he was a corporal in the police force. But his story is even more chilling than the way he died. You see, Cabo carved out a legacy not as a protector of the law, but as one of Sao Paulo's most feared and corrupt police officers. A man once sworn to serve justice slowly descended into the dark recesses of the city's criminal underworld. Cabo had a reputation for being a deadly vigilante who killed a lot of people, claiming they were criminals. He would take the law into his own hands, sentencing people to death as he pleased, sometimes just because he didn't like how the person looked. So to justify his fascination for killing, he would join Sao Paulo's military police, setting out with the promise of upholding justice. But Sao Paulo was not just any battleground. The streets are treacherous, and the lines between right and wrong began to blur for many officers. This was a city overrun by gangs and corrupt police officers who worked for these gangs. So assigned to some of the most crime-ridden districts of Sao Paulo, Cabo got to see firsthand how everything worked. But instead of cracking down on crime, he formed alliances. He loved extortion, getting those bribes from the traffickers in exchange for protection. The knowledge of crime became his most valuable asset, and before long, he was more than just a crooked cop. Cabo was a major player in the very underworld he had sworn to defeat. And soon, Cabo became a gun for hire, often taking out rivals for gang members and businessmen alike. His descent reached a new level of notoriety when his ties to the notorious Escuadrillas da Muerte, or Death Squads, were exposed. These shadowy vigilante groups, composed of police officers and other law enforcers, bypassed the justice system entirely, executing criminals without trial. But these death squads weren't content with eliminating just hardened criminals. They killed indiscriminately, often targeting innocent people, sometimes using their power to settle scores within the criminal ecosystem itself. It was then that Cabo's true face came to light, not as a savior, but as an executioner with his own motives. And by the end of the 1980s, Cabo Oliveira had become a legend, feared by both criminals and civilians alike. His influence was no longer confined to his uniform. He was an enforcer for Sao Paulo's drug lords and racketeers, and that reach extended to every corner of the criminal empire. While within the police force, he maintained the illusion of a dedicated officer. Few dared to challenge him. Those who did were often met with sudden violent ends. Yet, for all his cunning, questions began to emerge. How could a man tasked with safeguarding the streets of Sao Paulo now control him with fear? For years, whispers of his double life grew louder within the police force, but his reputation and alliances shielded him from consequence. A storm was coming, but not even Cabo could predict how hard it would hit. September 1982, people are protesting the unchecked police corruption and brutal death squads. It gets so hot that the Brazilian government and the internal police affairs had no choice but to act. Investigations were launched, and Cabo found himself at the center of it all. The gig was up, and the evidence was overwhelming.
Por uma série de procedimentos exigidos pela vara de execuções criminais, entre eles o exame criminológico.
The trial was a spectacle, attracting every major news outlet. Cabo's fall was a harsh indictment of the widespread rot within Brazilian police forces. Now, he was convicted and sentenced to 113 years in prison, and many still say that that's not enough. How many deaths did he orchestrate from the shadows? How many lives were destroyed by the system he manipulated? Well, I guess we'll never know. Because in prison, Cabo had become a target, stripped of his influence. His reputation as a corrupt cop who had crossed both criminals and lawmen alike made him a marked man. The very alliances he had fostered outside the prison now worked against him, as his enemies finally found their opportunity for revenge. September 2012, Oliveira was attacked. Some say it was coordinated, others say it was a result of a long-brewing grudge amongst inmates. Whatever caused it didn't matter. He was overpowered and shot about 20 times. Florisvaldo de Oliveira's death marked the final, brutal end to a life defined by betrayal, corruption, and bloodshed. The man who had once controlled death squads and wielded unchecked power was now just another casualty in a system he had helped break. In his final moments, he was no longer the feared Cabo Oliveira. He was just another prisoner, meeting a fate he had long orchestrated for others.